It's not often a ghost is admitted in evidence, but this was indeed the case at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh in the mid-18th century. Although it spoke in Gaelic, the ghost was that of an English soldier. By 1749, most of Scotland had resigned itself that no Stuart monarch would reign again, but in the Highlands there was still some sympathy for the Jacobites and Prince Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. As such, armed forces were still garrisoned in the Highlands. A member of one of those garrisons was Sergeant Arthur Davies. In September that year, Davies with a party of 8 men from the regiment of Foot were quartered at Dubrach, a small farm at Invery near Braemar, along with their commander, Lieutenant General Guise. They had moved there from Aberdeen in June of that year to find and destroy any tartan they found, as it had been outlawed in 1746, and to dispose of any weapons. Another group guarded the Spittal of Glenshee, some 8 miles away. Once or twice a week, each small group met at the midway point between their 2 stations, the Cairnwell Pass. Davies was disliked by the men, but the locals found him cordial. He was fearless and thrifty, and always made sure his dress was perfectly neat. He was prosperous and had been married to Jean Gent for around a year. Once a day, he would walk up Strathdee to some uncultivated land and simply wander among the hills and glens, something he was told was dangerous, as he stood out too much in both his uniform and his fine civilian clothes. On the day in question, Thursday 28 September 1749, he'd headed up to the glen wearing a blue coat, striped silk vest, breeches and brown stockings. He wore silver buckles at his knees, carried a silver watch, had 24 silver buttons on his waistcoat, and carried a penknife and gun. His brown hair was tied back with a small black silk ribbon, and he wore a silver-laced hat. He also carried a green silk purse and leather purse, both of which carried some money, and wore 2 gold rings, one plain and engraved with the initials D.H. and the motto, "When this you see, remember me," and the other ring was described as a little lump of gold, with a heart raised up on it. He had said goodbye to his wife at the house of Michael Farquharson, where they were staying, and went to meet the patrol from Glenshee. 4 of his men followed soon after. He met John Greer in Glenclooney around an hour after sunrise. Davies chastised him for wearing tartan, but didn't arrest him, and he went on his way. When the men from Dubrach met the guard, they could see Davies on a hill and heard a shot, believing he was shooting at deer or a hare. The Glenshee party came across him at the water of Benbow, and he told them he was going to the hill to get a shot at the deer. They reminded him how dangerous it was, but he went anyway. He was never seen alive again. News soon spread about the missing Davies. Searches took place over the next 4 days, but no trace of him was found. As soon as his wife heard the news, she knew there was something wrong and insisted her husband had met foul play. In June 1750, Donald Farquharson, son of Michael with whom the Davises had lodged, received a message from Alexander Macpherson saying he wished to speak to him. The 2 met at a shepherd's hut in Glenclooney a few days later. Macpherson told him he was greatly troubled by an apparition that had appeared, The ghost of Sergeant Davies. Davies told the frightened man that he should bury his bones, and after he said no, he asked him to ask Donald to bury them. Farquharson didn't believe Macpherson's story, but Macpherson told him he'd found the bones and offered to take him to the spot. So Donald agreed. Macpherson led him to the hill of Christie, and there lay the body of Sergeant Davies, lying on the surface of the peat moss, reduced to a near skeleton. Fragments of his clothing remained, including the black silk ribbon that tied his hair back, a fragment of blue cloth, and his shoes, although the tags for the buckles had been cut off. Macpherson admitted he'd found them 8 days beforehand and had pulled the remains from under a bank. Farquharson asked him if the ghost had said where the bones were to be buried, but it hadn't, so they were buried where they lay. Meanwhile, Macpherson had told John Gruer about his discovery and the ghost, and showed him where he'd found him. It wasn't far from where Gruer and the sergeant had met. Gruer told him to say nothing about it, or he'd put in a complaint about him to John Shaw of Daldowney. Macpherson decided to tell Shaw himself, who again told him to conceal the matter and go and bury the body privately. He also told him not to tell the army, as the area would then be under suspicion and seen as rebel country. James Gruer, a relative of John Gruer's, discovered the sergeant's gun, and a girl called Isabel Ego found a silver-laced hat that was later identified as Davies. The barrack master later said that it had been reported 10 days after Sergeant Davies had disappeared that he'd been murdered by 2 young men about Inverie. That summer, rumours abound that the ghost had explicitly named his murderers as Duncan Jerrock or Clark and Alexander Ban MacDonald. Both men had disreputable characters and were known thieves in the area. In due course, both were apprehended, although that didn't take place until September 1753. They were held at Braemar Castle. Meanwhile, Sergeant Davies's body was exhumed from the hill and reburied. On Wednesday, 23rd January 1754, both men stood before Alexander Fraser, Lord Strichen, and William Murray, Lord Dunmore, each giving different accounts of their movements on the day in question. A trial date was set for June. At the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh on Monday 10th June, they appeared before Charles Erskine, Lord Alva, the Lord Justice Clerk, who presided, and Lords Strichen and Dunmore, Patrick Grant, Lord Elkies, and James Ferguson, Lord Kilkerran. The Lord Advocate William Grant of Preston Grange led the case for the prosecution, while the 2 men were defended by Alexander Lockhart and Robert Mackintosh. The sergeant's wife was the first to take the stand and identified the gun and hat found as her husband's, followed by Donald Farquharson, who recounted what Macpherson had told him about the ghost. Then Macpherson took the stand. He now went into detail about the ghost. One night in June 1750, he was in bed when a vision appeared to him of a man clad in blue, who at first he thought was a real living man, the brother of Donald Farquharson. The spirit moved to the door of the hut, and he followed it outside, where it said, "I am Sergeant Davies." It went on that when flesh, he'd been murdered on the hill of Christie nearly a year before, describing in detail where his body was hidden, and requested he bury it. Macpherson had asked who'd killed him, but the ghost wouldn't say, then vanished in the twinkling of an eye. At this point, Macpherson did nothing, but exactly a week later, the ghost reappeared, naked, and minded him to bury the body, with help from Donald Farquharson. Once again, Macpherson told the court he'd asked who the perpetrators were, and this time the apparition replied, Duncan Clark and Alexander MacDonald. Both times the ghost spoke in Gaelic, but in life the sergeant was unfamiliar with the language. Robert McIntosh, defending, noted during cross-examination of Macpherson that he swore the ghost spoke as good Gaelic as ever he heard in Lochaber. Pretty well for the ghost of an English sergeant, the solicitor replied. Macpherson went on to testify that he'd eventually been employed by Clark, as he'd fallen on good fortune, and became a tenant of 2 farms. He noticed Clark had a long green silk purse, and his wife Elizabeth Downey wore a gold ring with a seal on it, both of which he knew to have belonged to the dead man. Whatever the judges thought of the ghost, another witness backed up the claims, and that was Isabel McCarty, who owned the shieling where the ghost had appeared, although she never saw it the first time. The second time it came, she was sleeping, but woke up for some reason, and saw something naked come in at the door in a bowing posture. Instead of screaming, she pulled the covers over her head and hid. The following morning, she told Macpherson what she saw, but having decided to do as the ghost asked, he reassured her, saying that it would not trouble them any more. On 12th June, the jury went out to deliberate. Both men were found not guilty of the murder of Sergeant Davies, and Clark and MacDonald were dismissed from the court. There was and is much debate around the death of the sergeant and the ghost story, but the question remains, who killed Sergeant Davies? If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.